This lecture is meant to provide you with an overview of estates and future interests. When we talk about an estate in land, we're referring to an interest in real property. Now, that property interest can be categorized in one of two ways. It can be considered a freehold estate or a non-freehold estate. The primary difference between a freehold and a non-freehold estate is that with a freehold estate, you get title to the land, and you usually have the ability to transfer your interest in the land to somebody else. A non-freehold estate gives people the right to possess the land, but not necessarily the other rights that come with property ownership. So a non-freehold estate, you can think of it as a lease, whereas a freehold estate is what we typically think of when we think of property ownership. Another way to characterize or to think of land interests is to distinguish between interests that allow for present possession and those that are future interests, where an individual has a property interest, but that property interest does not include a current right to possess the property. So when we talk about present possessory estates, we are talking about the right to possess the property right now in the present time, whereas future interests are when there is an interest there, a property interest there, but possession doesn't happen until sometime in the future. In the United States, we allow for what's called alienability, which is the transfer of property from one person to another person, or from one company to another company. This transfer can be done while the person is alive in a gift, right? And that's typically done through a deed. It can be done by will. We say that when we say a property is divisible, that means that it can be passed by will. Or it can be descendable. And what we mean by that is that it can pass through intestate succession. So what's intestate succession? Well, if someone does not leave a will, then property or a trust instrument, then property passes through intestate succession. And intestate succession means that a set of state rules or default rules apply, and the property is transferred based on what those rules are. So these are the three methods for transfer. It can be done in inter vivos grants, which are typically done through deeds. It can be done by will, or it can be done in intestate succession. So let's start by talking about present possessory interests. The first we're going to discuss is the Feesimple. So the Feesimple is the largest possible estate that you can have in land. And what that means is the most number of rights are associated with a Feesimple. Now, these rights include an unencumbered right to sell or convey the property in part or in entirety to somebody else. It also allows for the property to be devised, right? So it can be passed by will. And the property is also descendable, right? So think of Feesimple as the whole pie, right? This is the largest quantum that you could have in the land. you can tell you have a fee simple if you have words that say and his heirs or and her heirs. That denotates a fee simple. But a fee simple is also the default. So if there are no indications of any limitations or any other words that would trigger one of the other classifications that we're going to talk about, then the default rule is that the conveyance is in fee simple. So, to summarize, a fee simple estate is alienable, meaning that it can be transferred during life or an inter vivos transfer. It is divisible. It can be transferred using a will. And is descendable. It can be transferred under intestate laws. Okay, we're going to move on to the next type of present possessory estate, and that is a life estate. A life estate is less of an estate than a fee simple because it only allows the holder of the title to enjoy the land for the period of a lifetime. The language that's used to signify a life estate indicates that intent, that it is for life until B dies, while B is alive. So any language that indicates that enjoyment of the property or ownership of the property is limited to a life. All right, that means it is a life estate. We call the life the measuring life. And once the measuring life is done, once the person dies, then the estate automatically terminates. Now, I said that it is measured by a life. That life does not have to be the life of the transferee. It could be the life of a third party. And we call that a life estate per autre vie. A future interest always follows a life estate because when a transferor conveys a life estate, they have not conveyed all of their interest in the property. As a result, there is going to be a future interest because there needs to be another conveyance after the measuring life is over. So if the holder of a fee simple conveys a life estate, then a future interest will always follow. And that future interest is either a reversion or a remainder. A reversion is a future interest in the transferor, and it becomes possessory or a present interest upon the expiration of the life estate. So the future interest is held by the transferor. Alternatively, you can have a remainder where the future interest is held by a third party. Now, this also becomes possessory at the expiration of the preceding life estate, and it doesn't cut that life estate short at all. So it just naturally, the life estate ends, and then the remainder becomes possessory. So here, just to highlight, the primary difference between a reversion and a remainder is that a reversion transfers or holds the future interest is held by the transferor, whereas with the remainder, the future interest is held by a third party, not the transferor. Now remember, the transferor is the person who originally transferred the land. There are two types of remainders that you can have as a future interest after a life estate. The first is called a vested remainder. A remainder is vested if it is conveyed to an ascertainable person and it is not subject to a condition precedent, other than, of course, the natural termination of the preceding estate. So what do I mean by an ascertainable person? Well, if you have a name, you know automatically that you have an ascertainable person. An ascertainable person is a person that we can point to, right? So if you can point to an individual, then you have an ascertainable person. It also cannot be subject to any condition before it becomes possessory. It must automatically become possessory at the termination or the completion of the previous estate. A remainder is contingent then if one of the two requirements for a vested remainder aren't met. And the first is that it is conveyed to an unascertainable person. And this happens usually when it is conveyed to a class. A class is a group. So, for example, if a gift is made to her children is a class. It is a group that members can be added to at a later date as long as they fit that classification. Now, as soon as there are some members of that group, we say that group, that class becomes vested, but it's subject to open. So let's say somebody has two children, Tom and Jerry. Now that class has vested, but it's subject to open because the class is still open. We can still add new members of the class. And so if later on a third child is born, that third child is also added to the class, and it continues until the class is closed. When does the class close? The class closes when the first person can make their claim possessory. So when you're dealing with a life estate, at the termination of the previous estate, at the termination of the life estate, a vested remainder subject to open would become just a vested remainder. Class closes. Okay. The second way you can have a contingent remainder is if the remainder is subject to a condition. So if something aside from the completion of the previous estate has to happen, then you have added a condition to making the interest possessory, and you have a contingent remainder. Let's do a couple hypotheticals to help us distinguish between a fee simple and a life estate. So here we have a conveyance that reads O to C. There is no language behind this that would indicate that there are any limitation to O to C's enjoyment or ownership of the land. Therefore, that means this is a fee simple, because remember, fee simples are the largest estate that you could possibly get. Now let's compare this to a life estate. Here, O divises to C for life, then to X. Well, here you notice there is this additional language for life right here, and that language limits C's interest, and it limits it to life. C would be the measuring life here. And at the end of C's life, once his life is over, then the property would go to X. So X gets a remainder here. That remainder is vested. Why? Because we know who the person is. They're ascertainable. And there are no conditions that are tied to X receiving or gaining possession of the property. So here we would have a vested remainder in fee simple. Okay. So let's change this a little bit. Let's say that we cross this out. Here cross out this language here at the end, and let's say that the conveyance just read O to C for life. Well, then we would have, C still would have a life estate, but we would have a reversion. Why would we have a reversion? Well, there is a remaining interest. What happens to the property after C dies? Something needs to happen to the property. And in this case, because we removed the third party remainder conveyance here, we would have a reversion. O would get the property back after C passes away. All right, we're going to move on to another type of present possessory estate. It's called a FEETAIL. Now, the FEETAIL is not a very common estate anymore. Very few states allow for it, but it is on the bar exam, so we are testing it here. All right, let's talk about what a FEETAIL is. A FEETAIL is another estate that is smaller than a fee simple. So somebody with a fee simple can decide to convey a FEETAIL in the property, but just like with the life estate, with the FEETAIL, we have something left over. The FEETAIL provides a present possession to the transferee, and then once the transferee dies, to his direct lineal descendants. But once that bloodline is done, then the land is conveyed to another, right? So who that other is depends on the remaining language in the conveyance. All right, let's take a look at an example. So FEETAIL is created by the words "and the heirs of his body" or "of her body." And so an example would be O conveys Greenacre to B and the heirs of his body. Here we have a FEETAIL. B has a FEETAIL. Now, a FEETAIL can be there's three different types of FEETAIL. So we have a FEETAIL general, which is the example that we just saw, and this is any of the children of the grantee when the grantee dies. So any of their descendants can take. But there are also two other kinds of FEETAILs that are more specific. The first is a FEETAIL male, or it could be a FEETAIL female. And this type of FEETAIL limits the conveyances only to either the male or the female heirs of the grantee, whatever they had specified. So that's called a FEETAIL male or a FEETAIL female. You can also have something called a FEETAIL special. A FEETAIL special limits the grantee's descendants that are eligible to take by limiting them to a mother or a father. So it could be a spouse, and that's what I have here, but they're limited to the child of, let's say, Janet, or the child of Tom. So it would be between the person who gets the children of a particular bloodline. Let's look at a couple hypotheticals so we can try to identify the differences between a fee simple, a life estate, and a FEETAIL. So the first, again, remember this is a fee simple. There is no language of limitation after C. C receives the full fee simple because remember, O has a fee simple and he's just giving his fee simple to C. The second example, O to C for life. Here there is language of limitation that is for life, and we know that C here has a life estate. Now, let's take a look at this third conveyance, to C and the heirs of his body. Here, C has a FEETAIL. You see the difference? All right, moving on. The next type of present possessory interest that we are going to discuss is called a fee simple defeasible. it is a type of defeasible estate. A defeasible estate is an estate that can end upon the occurrence of some future event. So defeasible estates end when a particular event happens, and a fee simple defeasible is a type of defeasible estate. So a fee simple defeasible is an estate that can continue on in perpetuity forever, or it can end on the occurrence of a future event. So when that event happens, or if it happens, it gives the right to possess the land back to the transferor. So, putting it another way, when you have a fee simple determinable, it is a fee simple estate in the transferee that automatically ends and reverts back to the transferor if a certain event or condition occurs or fails to occur. Again, a fee simple determinable is a type of fee simple estate in a transferee that automatically reverts to the transferor when a certain event or condition either occurs or fails to occur. So how do you know if you have a fee simple defeasible? Well, you'll know because there will be the following words. It would either say as long as, while, until, or during. If you see these trigger words, you know you have a fee simple defeasible. Let's take a look at this example. O conveys Greenacre to B and her heirs as long as it is used as a school. Here, B has a fee simple determinable because the words as long as are included in the conveyance to B. So we have to address what's going to happen if that condition happens, right? Because we're not giving B a straight fee simple. Well, here there is a possibility of reverter because if it doesn't state where the next conveyance will be, you know automatically that it's going to go back to, see, there's no then here, so we know automatically it'll go back to O. So there's a possibility of reverter. So O has a possibility of reverter. Now, we're going to talk about future interests in a few, but just as a preview, a possibility of reverter is a future interest that automatically becomes possessory on the happening or of a stated condition, or if a stated condition doesn't happen, right? So this is it becomes automatically possessory if this event occurs. So that is a fee simple determinable. The next type of defeasible estate that we are going to discuss, it's called a fee simple subject to a condition subsequent. And a fee simple subject to a condition subsequent is a fee simple estate that is created or given to the transferee that can be terminated at the election of the transferor when a certain condition occurs. So, again, it is a fee simple that's created in the transferee that can be terminated at the election of the transferor, meaning we don't have an automatic possessory interest like we did, or an automatic transfer back to the transferor if that condition occurs. So if we state it a little bit differently, the transferee or the transferor can terminate if he chooses when a certain condition or event occurs. Now that right to terminate the preceding estate based on the happening of a condition is called the right of entry. Some also call it the right of reentry, but we'll use right of entry in this class. How do you know if you have a fee simple subject to a condition subsequent instead of a fee simple determinable? Well, you will see different language. So the language that triggers or that lets you know that you have a fee simple subject to a condition subsequent is provided that, but if, or on the condition that. You also will usually have language that states that the transferor has the right to re-enter the property. Re-enter and take the property. The third type of defeasible estate is a fee simple subject to an executory limitation. A fee simple subject to an executory limitation is a defeasible fee simple that is followed by a transfer to a third party. So here we're not transferring the property back to the transferor upon the happening of an event. We're transferring it to a third party. All right, so with the fee simple determinable and the fee simple subject to condition subsequent, both of those were followed by a future interest that were retained by the transferor. Here, the future interest is retained by a third party. So that's how you will know that you have a fee simple subject to an executory limitation. With a fee simple determinable, like we said, we have a possibility of a reverter. And again, that's to the transferor. And we said that is an automatic possessory interest on the happening of an event, or if an event doesn't happen. The fee simple is subject to condition subsequent. We said the future interest is a right of reentry to the transferor, right? Again, we have a future interest in the transferor here. And this differs from an executory interest, where an executory interest is to a third party. Now, the language, so when we differentiated between a fee simple determinable or a fee simple subject to condition subsequent, we said that you can tell the difference depending on the type of language used. We said that as long as, while, until, and during indicated that we have a fee simple determinable. Alternatively, we also said that provided that, but if, on condition that, indicated to us that we have a fee simple subject to condition subsequent. Well, all of these words indicate that you have a fee simple subject to an executory limitation. The difference, so how do you tell, again, the difference between an FSSEL and your fee simple determinable and your fee simple subject to condition subsequent is who retains the future interest. Is it the transferor or is it a third party? We're officially going to talk about future interests now, although we already have said future interests many a time up until this point. So let's talk about future interests. The present possessory interests that we discussed indicate who has the right to possess the property right now. And we said that in a conveyance, the information, the types of estates that can be given that are present possessory estates are a fee simple, a life estate, and a FEETAIL. Then we also said that are some left over, right? There's some interests that are left over there. We have to figure out what happens to the property if we have a life estate and a FEETAIL. And we started talking about future interests. We're going to go into more depth here. So future interests can be retained by the transferor. And just to review, those interests are a reversion, and that we said can happen with a life estate, for example. So we have a reversion. We have a possibility of a reverter, and we have a right of entry, right? So those were the three that we looked at. So reversions happen if there are a life estate. Possibility of reverter can happen if we have a fee simple determinable, and a right of reentry can happen or happens when we have a fee simple subject to condition subsequent. So these are the future interests that can be retained by a transferor. Now let's talk about the future interests that are created in a transferee. So if the owner of a fee simple transfers an estate that is smaller than a fee simple to a transferee, there is a remaining future interest. And that remaining future interest can be either a remainder or an executory interest. So the future interest that's created in a third-party transferee, the only two options you have are a remainder or an executory interest. Now, again, review. We said that there are more than one type of remainder. We said there is a vested remainder and a contingent remainder. And remember, we said that for a remainder to be vested, we needed to have an ascertainable beneficiary and no conditions placed before the interest becomes possessory. All right, so that is a vested remainder. Breaking it down even further, when we say a vested remainder, what we are talking about, it really is an indefeasibly vested remainder, meaning that the remainder is vested. Somebody already has the interest. The interest is cannot be taken away from them or decreased. You can have some vested remainders that, so if they're subject to divestment, that means although they currently have a vested remainder, they currently have an interest in the property, they currently have a future interest in the property, that future interest can be taken away based on the happening of an event or a condition, or so that we call that a vested remainder subject to divestment. And then there are vested remainders subject to open. Vested remainders subject to open are when you have a gift to a class. A class is a group or category. So if you have a transfer to Jane in life, then to Tom's children, and at the time of conveyance, Tom only has one child named Lily. Lily would have a vested remainder subject to open. Why is it subject to open? Well, the class is still open, meaning that children can still be added to that class, and then they will get an interest, and that will decrease the proportion of interest that Lily gets. So we say that class is subject to open. And it remains subject to open until the class closes. The class closes when it becomes possessory. So in the example I just gave you, when the previous life estate ends, the class closes, and it will just be a vested remainder. But until that happens, it is a vested remainder subject to open. remember, we can also have a contingent remainder. We said a contingent remainder is when it's an unascertainable beneficiaries, or there is a condition that must occur before the interest becomes possessory. Now, you can also have an executory interest. So rather than have a remainder, you might have an executory interest as a future interest. Because remember, remainders only follow certain types of estates. An executory interest is, remember we said, an interest that's held by a third party. And it follows a condition. The happening of a condition that cuts or executes the preceding estate. So again, an executory interest is a future interest in a third-party transferee that must divest another estate or cut that estate short for it to become possessory. If the executory interest follows the possession by a transferor, then it's called a springing estate. If the executory interest follows the interest of a transferee, then it's a shifting executory interest. All right, so again, the shifting executory interest is when the executory interest follows an interest that the transferee holds. A springing executory interest occurs if the executory interest follows an interest held by the transferor. This graph taken from your workbook does a great job of putting the different types of estates together in a way that helps you visualize the relationships between them. So we said we have here, let me get this laser pointer out. We have here present possessory estates, right? So we have all of these are present possessory estates, all of these over here, right? And we can have a fee simple when it's absolute, or it means that it has, it is the largest estate you can possibly have. So sometimes you can call it a fee simple absolute. In this class, whenever we see fee simple, we're assuming it's an absolute. This fee simple could also be defeasible if there's some type of limiting language after it, right? We said that limiting language can make it a fee simple determinable, or it could make it a fee simple subject to condition subsequent. And for both of these, it requires that the transferor retains the future interest, right? We said a fee simple determinable happens automatically, whereas a fee simple subject to condition subsequent, the transferor retains the right of entry, which they can decide whether or not they want to exercise. You can also have a fee simple subject to an executory limitation. And we said that the difference between a fee simple subject to an executory limitation and a fee simple determinable or a fee simple subject to a condition subsequent is that the future interest is held by a third party, a transferee, and they hold an executory interest. That is their future interest. So these are the different types of fee simples. Alternatively, you can have a FEETAIL. You can have, so the owner always starts off over here with a fee simple, and they can convey a fee simple, which is a complete conveyance. They can convey a FEETAIL, right? And if you have a FEETAIL, then you will always have a reversion here by the transfer, or the transferor can convey a life estate, in which case you will either have a reversion, a remainder, or an executory interest. You'll have one of these three as the future interest. And it'll depend on, you'll be able to tell based on who retains that future interest. All right. And then we have a term of years, which is, we did not review. It is pretty simple. A term of years is a term of years. So it'll say 2x for 10 years. You have a term of years. When you have a term of years, the future interest that can follow is either a reversion, a remainder, or an executory interest. Again, we look to who retains the right. That'll help us figure out which of these types of estates we have. So that is estates and future interests in a nutshell. Now we're going to talk about a rule called the rule against perpetuities. And it is one of the rules that are used to make a property more marketable. There are other rules that we are not covering, and you will likely need to look at them before the bar exam, but one of the most complex of the rules is the rule against perpetuity. The justification for the rule was that if property, if land has conditions on it, that conditions that can happen at a remote, distant time in the future, then who's going to want to buy the property, right? It's going to make the land less marketable. So this rule was developed to increase the marketability of land. Now, a lot of jurisdictions have exceptions or additional rules to the rule against perpetuities. But what we're going to look at and focus on in this class is the common law, the common law rule. So here is the common law rule against perpetuities. No interest is good unless it must vest, if at all, no later than 21 years after some life in being at the creation of the interest. Pretty simple, right? Okay, maybe not so simple, but let's break it down a little bit. All right. So no interest is good. So what does that mean? Well, that part tells us if the interest violates this rule, that means that interest is no good, right? We're going to cross that interest out. So we'll come to that later. No interest is good unless it must vest, if at all, no later than 21 years after some life in being at the creation of the interest. What does that mean? Well, if you have a conditional remainder, for example, it must be able to vest. It must definitely vest. It must definitely vest no later than 21 years after everybody that was alive and named in the conveyance dies. There are only 3 interests that are subject to this rule. You only need to worry about the rule against perpetuity if you have a contingent remainder, sorry about that. The slide went a little wonky. All right. You only need to worry about applying the rule against perpetuities if you have a contingent remainder, an executory interest, or a vested remainder subject to open. If you do have a violation of the rule against perpetuities, you are going to strike the violating part of the conveyance. I highly recommend that you use the method that is presented in your workbook to map out or create a timeline for contingent remainders, executory interest, or vested remainders subject to open in order to figure out whether the rule against perpetuities apply. There are plenty of examples in your book, in your workbook, so please take the time to use the methods described, and if you have any questions, then please let me know.